Hello, welcome to Reaction Norm. I'm Michael McConkey, and this is the world's leading broadcast on biology and culture and politics, or so I'm saying. So this is our second week in which we're going weekly, and not auspiciously at all, Patricia is again away. So she just got back from her assignment, but that we remember last week I said she was away on assignment. So she got back from her assignment. But a little too dogged to come on with us today. But I am joined again by Charles. Charles, welcome aboard. How you doing?
I'm doing great, Michael. How are you?
Fantastic. So we have a topic which I'm hoping will be controversial and provocative. For the sort of working title, maybe it'll change by the time this actually gets posted on YouTube, is going to be Eugenics and the Law Today. So what can that possibly mean? So before we get into what the implications of that title actually are, we probably need to flesh out a little bit the concept of eugenics, because this is a pretty loaded term. There's a lot of strong emotion for people when they hear the term. So to start off with, Charles, what do you think, if we're going to have an intelligent discussion about eugenics, what is, as a sort of first order of information, what is it that you think people have to understand to have that conversation?
Yeah, so I think we should first give it a bit of context and acknowledge something. For a lot of people, when they say the word eugenics, they mean it almost like a swear word, right? They mean it as an insult. In the same way, like fascist is it seems often far removed from the original meaning, and it means more of like, they're trying to like swear at you, they're trying to insult you, right? And eugenics seems to have taken on that meaning, but eugenics did at one point have a different meaning. At one point, it was even seen positively, and I'm not suggesting it should or shouldn't be seen positively now. It just, historically it did at one point. Eugenics seems to, I guess one way you could think of it is that people believe that through eugenics that you could improve the human condition. And there was a point in history where I think it was after the Industrial Revolution, where it was believed that, the human kind of stock were degrading in different ways. And there was different beliefs over why this happened. And again, I'm not saying this is good. This is just describing history. What I remember reading, this is like, I think I read this like 15, 20 years ago. So some of this is kind of fuzzy. What I remember reading before was that because of, after the Industrial Revolution, there were conditions where people who were poor, less advantaged, could survive, right, and have children. And I remember reading stuff that the haves were complaining about, the have-nots or the poor filling up all the green space. And there was a belief that that was degrading, the human stock, right? And there was also a belief that something had to be done about this, right? There was also some beliefs that part of why the human condition was degrading was that domesticated strains of humans were, breeding and crossbreeding with other groups and stuff like that, and that there was a desire to remove this. So that's I guess like some of the historic context, and so that's that. Okay, so I mean, just literally, the word just means, improving things, making things better. And you can contrast that with, dysgenics, where things are being made worse, right? And of course, when I've seen people use this term nowadays, they use it in a kind of subjective, squishy sense. Well, what's good? What's better? And what's bad? What's worse? If some people, for example, I've noticed will they'll elevate whatever they think they're good at, or what they think they could become good at, or, things based on the cultural, context they kind of like grew up in or consider themselves part of. For example, if you're very, strong, you might consider strength to be good and better. If you're very intelligent, you might consider, IQ and intelligence to be better. If you're very pious, you might consider being very spiritual, religious to be better. And then just et cetera, just kind of depends. So, in that sense, eugenics is kind of subjective, right? You can also get into the aspects of, well, do you mean what people would call positive eugenics or negative eugenics? And the positive and negative shouldn't be interpreted morally in terms of like, this is good eugenics and this is bad eugenics. It's that, okay, people don't breed at random, right? They, pick their partner. They're pretty selective. They discriminate in a sense, right? And in that sense, you're doing these kind of actions voluntarily. That would be called positive eugenics. And in that sense, like everyone's practicing eugenics. Like you're not breeding randomly, even though people don't like the word eugenics, but that you don't breed randomly is a type of eugenics. But also there's the instance where someone like, the state, the government, might start sterilizing people or might start killing certain people. And that's often put under the umbrella of negative eugenics, right? And that did happen for quite a while. My understanding of the history is that there was a period of time where, this was a very popular belief that, something had to be done to improve the human condition. Don't interpret this to say these are exactly the same, but the popularity seemed to be, my sense of it seemed to be similar to the way global warming is like interpreted today. And I'm not saying that, global warming is wrong or right. I'm not trying to suggest that, but just like the public perception of it, that people felt there was this emergency and something had to be done, right? And there were sterilization programs in different parts of the world, like the US had them, there were parts of Europe that had them. At one point, one government, implemented, a lot of the different policies that people were suggesting, right? And the ones that the government was like Germany, like Nazi Germany at the time. And you think of that as like, maybe the Kyoto Accord or something like that. They finally kind of implemented all these different policies. They didn't kind of hold back, right? And I'm not trying to, conflate.
I know you're not. I can just see people clipping that little bit, and say, "Look what Charles said."
That's going to be put out of context. But I'm trying to put it in historical context that like government-based eugenics, like forced sterilization, it was very popular at one time. And I'm not saying that's good. I'm just like, that's the historical context. It was very popular. And, it's just the way it was back then. And okay, so we have, that historic grounding from it, right? And we also have today that people use it as almost a swear word, and the word has lost meaning in a sense. But I think that, for us discussing it, we want to talk about it in the sense of where it's the literal sense, right? Where it's that something's being selected for. Essentially, it's like, there's selection happening. And it might be that, if you like that kind of selection, you might consider that eugenic. If you don't like that selection, you might consider that dysgenic. For example, if maybe you're not the type that considers strength or piety to be the virtue you want to maximize, maybe you consider intelligence, IQ or whatever to be the virtue you want to maximize. You might consider something that selects for IQ to be eugenic, something that selects against IQ to be dysgenic, right? But it could be other stuff. If you're very spiritual or very religious and your religious background considers loose sex to be, bad and, waiting till you're married to be good, then you seeing people who engage in like kind of short life history type typical behavior and engaging in loose and quick and plenty sex to be dysgenic, right? So yeah.
Okay, that's pretty good. Thanks. That's a good introduction to get us started. So there's a number of points that you brought up there that I'd like to drill down a little bit more into. So first of all, you brought up the distinction between positive and negative eugenics, making the point that positive is usually thought of as something that's adding to or making better the pool of humanity, or the population that you're trying to affect, and negative is usually described as removing from, right? And the class, and you yourself made the reference to coercive policies, where even in places in like in North America and in Europe, not just the Nazis, were engaged in various kinds of certainly negative and even coercive forms of eugenics, but often also considered negative is incentives, right? So you would actually give people incentives, like offer them something if they were willing to get themselves sterilized. If they would consent to being sterilized, they would get some kind of a payoff of some kind. So this is usually also considered under negative. So, I mean, we would probably want to make the distinction between incentives and coercion. But I don't know, do we actually, what do we think about incentives, right? Because I mean, often the point here is to try and eliminate people that are cognitively low functioning. And you might argue these are not people in a position to have a valid claim to have consented, to have understood what they were consenting to when they consented to this kind of thing. So I don't know, is that in a distinction that you'd want to emphasize? Do you have anything to say about that?
No, I do think that's a important distinction, right? And like understanding the structure of how it can happen, right? Like, people making voluntary choice and, someone coming like basically with a threat of shooting you and doing whatever. And also just people, I guess you could think of it as kind of rigging the game, like changing the environments that you exist in without necessarily, threatening to kill you. But, like, for example, if money is given to some people and not. One thing I did want to point out, some of the historic eugenics movement, as far as I know, it wasn't just exalting like intelligence, right? There were some individuals who were, set up for like, sterilization or killing or whatever, because the intelligence they had, it was believed was through like means of human domestication. It wasn't the, I guess, the right kind of intelligence, so there were other conditions around that.
And though I'm a big fan of the intelligence literature and think that the whole intelligence thing has to be taken much more into account, as would be evident from discussion we had a couple episodes ago, it is worth noting that a lot of the people who were important intelligence scholars were really on the bandwagon of eugenics. Pearson and Francis Galton and others. I can't remember the names, but I know quite a few of them were in on this.
So it was wildly popular. Like I'm not gonna say. Well, I have a family member who was alive during that period, so it was like in World War II and stuff like that. And I asked him, about that, like why were people doing that? I was quite young when I asked that, and he told me that it was very popular at the time. Like a lot of people, saw this as a very positive thing, like the whole eugenics thing. And that's why I try to compare it to like the global warming movement today. And I'm not talking about the science of it. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the popularity, the populism around the global warming movements and the green movements and the climate change and what's now called climate change. Not the science. So we're not talking about the science, just the populism, right? Like there was a lot of populism behind it, kind of pushing it. And obviously not everyone, right? But the same thing with eugenics movement. It seemed to be there was a lot of populism behind it that were supporting this, right?
Yeah, I'm not sure. Yeah, and I'm not sure that there was really any problem with the science, even around coercive eugenics. I don't think there's any problem with the science. That wasn't the issue. It was the moral, ethical, values-based issues that were really at stake here, right? And this is a point that we continually reiterate on this show: is that science is never going to give you your morals. Science is not going to give you your values, right? That's a separate issue.
Yeah,
but there is a.
My understanding was there was also some debate around the science, right? There was, for example, there was a belief over what characteristics were from domestic forms of humans, right? And I'll give you an example. If you look at like wild pigs, right? They're quite hairy, they have tusks, they're quite brutal. And then you get the domestic ones, they start getting a little colorful, like the eye color will change, they'll get paler skin. And stuff like that. There was debate over, for example, whether blonde hair should be eradicated or exalted, right? And I mean, like we know the way eugenics, like who won that debate, right? Like blonde hair was, for example, in some strains of the eugenics movement was exalted, but there was debate that this was believed to be a sign of domestication in humans, and some people wanted to completely eliminate it.
Right.
So I mean, like even from like the science, and I'm not saying like. This is definitely not to support, whether some humans are domesticated or not, or that has effect. I mean, like today it's kind of weird because it's kind of flipped. There's a lot of people who see potential human domestication as a positive thing. So there's a number of books talking about how we self-domesticated ourselves. But like in the past, this was seen as a very, morally negative thing, right? And people wanted to eliminate it. But yeah, I'm definitely not saying like this is a good thing or not. This is just descriptive.
Yeah, yeah. So, and another thing I wanted to that you sort of touched upon in your introductory remarks there that I wanted to flesh out is a bit of the history thing, and it's actually maybe it's also worth making the point because it may not be obvious to everyone who's listening to this, because if they hear the term eugenics, there's probably a tendency to think that the second half of that, right, the second two syllables there actually has something to do with genetics, right, of genes. And of course, it has nothing at all to do with genes. This term was coined by Francis Galton in the 19th century when the term gene didn't really exist in the way that we use it now. And in fact, what the term was used for, what the term referred to was the idea of birth, as in the term genesis, right, to give birth to something, right? So the idea was good birth or well birthed or well birthed or something, or well born or something like this, right? This was what it meant. And of course, this as a practice, this goes way back, right? I mean, it doesn't start in the 19th century. I mean, we can go back to Plato was basically promoting eugenics, and his idea that the elite guardian class or whatever they were called, were going to, only marry amongst themselves, right? Because, they had the, particular qualities that they wanted to keep within that class of society, right? And there actually were, I mean, my preliminary or cursory readings on this in preparation for today, I found all kinds of really surprising historical examples. Apparently in Rome, there was a point during the Roman Empire, I don't remember if I read when, if I did, I don't remember what it was, that it was actually the law that parents had to kill deformed children who were born with physical deformities, right? It was a law. You had to kill your children if they were born with physical deformities. And also I read that in Sparta, that I can't believe this is true, but this is what I read, that in Sparta at a certain age, I think it was like 5 years old, that every child had to come before some council of elders who would decide if the child would continue to live or not, right? And so the implication would be that some were not, and they were killing them at like 5 years old or something. So I don't know, like they take that with a grain of salt, folks, but that's what I read. I think I actually read that on Wikipedia. So, what that's worth, I don't know, right? But they did have a source for it, but I didn't go read the article itself. So, but if you want to follow up on that, go ahead. But so crazy stuff, right? But the point is that that this stuff has been going on for a long time, and it's been directed at calling individuals, and the term eugenics has nothing to do with with genes. But having said that, we've now crossed over into a different situation where it's no longer so much about calling individuals as it's about calling genes, as we now have the capacity to actually intervene at a genetic level and make changes that are going to result in different kinds of individuals being born. Now, this was still the point of eugenics. You're still trying to affect the children that were being born, but you're no longer acting now directly on the parents as individual organisms, but you're acting at the level of the genes themselves, trying to create the children, as it were, right? So this has become a new kind of eugenics, a new kind of debate around eugenics. And I'll throw it to you in a second, Charles. I want to say that one of the things that seems to me to be odd in the discussion around this stuff is that those who like let's say that you want to eliminate a disease in a child, right? So you don't want the child to be born with a certain disease, and you have the capacity, whether we do today or not, or we will in the future, assuming that you have the capacity to intervene genetically and affect the genes of that child so that when they're born, they don't have the disease, right? This seems to be, seems as though, it would be a good thing. And there are those who criticize this, right? Who say that we're playing God and, we should be more, we should have more humility. I was also reading the Stanford Encyclopedia entry on eugenics, and they were talking about the arguments. People make the argument that we should have, more humility and be open to the novelty of life rather than trying to make everything perfect, or something like this as being the criticism. But it's an odd criticism, and I can understand that. But it is an odd criticism if you think that someone with the same disease as an adult, or even a child, goes to a doctor. You wouldn't expect the doctor to say, well, we should have more humility about nature, and this is the cards that nature gave you. So of course you'd expect the doctor to try and cure the person who had the disease. So why wouldn't you expect the same thing? If you could cure the child before the child was born, as it were, surely this would be a good thing, right? But this is a form of eugenics again, and you get into all kinds of arguments about, should you be intervening? Are you going to try and create a master race, and all these kind of things? So I don't know if you have any thoughts on all that.
Okay, so there's kind of different things there. So I mean, like there is some of this type of thing done, like whether they call it eugenics or not. I think they can detect Down syndrome when kids are in the fetus, and it's quite common for people to terminate the fetus when it has Down syndrome. I think Down syndrome isn't something that's passed down. I think it's caused by a mutation or a deletion or a duplication or something. I don't remember off the top of my head, but it's not something that you're going to pass down from child to child. It does seem that we're entering a realm of what you might call like cosmetic kind of like embryo selection or whatever you want to like term it. It also, there was something about, like over in China, they had that one guy who was making, or there was claims that he did something that made babies resistant to HIV. Okay, so there's that. Now, one thought I had, it's actually, I would probably say I was influenced by someone else, a friend of mine, on this. But one possibility, for example, is if you have a whole bunch of people, say, selecting for a certain trait, like let's say people like a certain kind of muscle tone, right? And it's called the genetic architecture of that is very simple, and everyone all of a sudden gets this version of this one gene or two genes or something like that. You do all of a sudden have, within that part of the genome, you have less variation. Having less variation can make it so you have more risk to disease, right? And I could see that as being a potential problem. Another potential problem, so mutations, whether you think in the form of, a single change from, the AGTC, a single change there, like an SNP change, or if you think of it of a copy number variation, you have sections of DNAs duplicated, or whether something's inverted, or whether something jumps from one part of the genome to another, or whether something's deleted. Most of the time, it's not that bad. It's slightly harmful, right? And some of these are more harmful than others. I think deletions in certain parts could be quite harmful, but sometimes you still have like an organism that's viable, and even you don't even notice the problem always, but sometimes you do. Most of the times it's slightly harmful, but this process seems to be absolutely necessary for evolutionary adaptation, right? So every now and then, you win the lottery and there's improvements, right? And short term, maybe there's benefits to like eliminating like all these mutations. I wonder if long term that's a good idea, right? Like if you eliminate this variability, it seems like you might be slowing down or stopping the process of evolutionary adaptation. So I guess my two criticisms I can think of off the top of my head is: one, less variation gives you larger disease risk. Two, you're slowing down or stopping the process of evolutionary adaptation. I guess those are my initial thoughts.
Yeah, that's. If you could intervene at the level, if you got to the point of sophistication, where you had you had a sophisticated enough intervention technology and a sophisticated enough sort of monitoring system of the genome, so that you could actually weed out every single mutation, right? Then yeah, you would bring evolution, at least in the Darwinian sense, to an end, I suppose, right? I mean, that's that's kind of a weird thought. But the point is, though, going back to the whole question of eugenics, though, this is most people, I think, would say that you shouldn't. It's almost like not only is it bad, not only is it not bad to intervene in this way, but you probably have kind of a moral obligation to intervene. If you can prevent a child from being born with some debilitating disease that makes them suffer and puts them in pain and kills them young or whatever, right? If you can prevent this, surely there's kind of an obligation to actually intervene in this way, right? So, at least in this way, eugenics, most people I think would consider, they may not think of that as eugenics, but it is eugenics, as we've tried to make clear here so far in the discussion. So most people I think would say that this is good, right? This is a form of eugenics that most people would sign on to. Do you think that's true?
Yeah, I do think that's a way that, what would literally be eugenics can come in. I mean, like another way is just like something everyone does. Like you're selective over who you date, over who you have kids with, or some people are, but I mean, like even with the guys who aren't that selective, they're still selected to a degree, right? So I mean, like that's a form of eugenics also. Just people, no one dares call that genetics, right?
Yeah. So, but I thought but I think that's important for us to get that clear before we move on to the second half of the discussion. I wanted to get that clear, that there is definitely that, eugenics, as you said, eugenics, doesn't mean what people think it means. That despite the connotations that associated, it's not a word that refers exclusively to, coercive Nazi extermination or sterilization. That's not what, it doesn't refer exclusively to that. It refers to other things, including things that most of us would agree are probably good things to do. So, so already we hopefully we've complicated the concept of eugenics, right? Making the point here that it's not all bad, and in some cases, most people would probably say it was good. So
yeah, I think some people. I'm not saying this is a good or bad thing. I think some people are probably worried that if you kind of give legitimacy to the word eugenics, like using it in a way that's not negative, you open the door to people engaging in like, forced sterilizations and, killings and murders and stuff like that.
How about we make a distinction between voluntary and coercive interactions? I mean, that might be a good place to begin. I know, like we talked about before, that may not solve every problem, but I mean, it's better to have a accurate, sophisticated understanding of what eugenics are, and make the distinction at the level where it's actually appropriate, rather than misusing a word as kind of a scare buzzword that prevents serious conversation about social policy and science, right?
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I just wanted to acknowledge.
Yeah. Well, no, I know. I'm not responding to you. I'm responding to them.
Yeah.
I'm responding to the people who you're invoking, right?
Yeah. Okay.
So with that clarification of eugenics, then, so I want to move on to this I don't know, theory, hypothesis that I've been promoting for a while, which is along the lines that, and this is where it's going to get interesting for people, because we've just gone through this whole discussion and wound up at the conclusion that voluntary eugenics might be good, whereas coercive eugenics are bad. But now I'm going to make an argument that maybe in some instances coercive eugenics are good. maybe we'll see, right? So what got me started on this, I think, was many years ago. I reading an article by, and just last week, I think, actually, when we were talking, I think I brought up Martin Daly and Margot Wilson, and here they come up again. I don't really bring them up that often, but here they are, came up 2 weeks in a row. So this is in a paper they wrote, the man who mistook his wife for a chattel or something. I think it's a play on a famous paper on neuroscience, psychology or something. And anyways, it was published in the book The Adapted Mind, which is published in '92, which is like the many people think of as being the beginning of sort of the start of modern evolutionary psychology. This book with all these famous essays by Pinker and all these other people. So in this essay, they're primarily talking about the proprietary attitude of men towards women in terms of solving paternal uncertainty and this sort of thing, right? But in the process, they get talking about law and how law applies in these situations in general. And they made this remark at one point in the essay. So I'll just read this. So 2 legal theories have been proposed to justify the imposition of a child support obligation on reluctant putative fathers. The theory of delict, I'm not even sure how that's pronounced, delict, D-E-L-I-C-T, whereby the father's liability arises from his mere illicit sexual access to the mother, and the theory of descent, whereby the father's liability is based on his genetic relationship with the child. Both theories are based on the idea that beneficiaries should pay, but they differ in focusing upon benefits of greater or lesser remove from fitness, namely sexual contact versus parenthood. Where delictual constructions have been tried, they have violated people's sense of justice and have failed. The implication is that people perceive children to constitute benefits to their genetic parents over and above any pleasure had in conceiving them, and over and above any material and social benefits they provide to whoever occupies a parental role. So the idea there is that you don't pay parental support just because you've actually had sex with a woman who got pregnant. It's got to be determined that it actually is your child. So you can think of a situation as, in a couple, and they bring this up in a relationship that is, some people made the benefit that fathers are interested in knowing the paternity of their children because they get certain kinds of benefits, and they're thinking like you get the work benefits of the children or something, right? Whatever kind of economic proceeds they bring. There's also the question of what children cost, but leaving that aside. But they're sort of making the case in this part of the essay that in fact the courts, through and law is kind of an evolutionary process of its own in a certain sense, right? So through time, it's come to be believed that in fact, even the father who has children who are not his biological children, who he's been, cuckolded by his wife, and is raising these children, he doesn't get any benefit from having the children, right? The benefit goes to the person who is the biological father, regardless of whatever the relationship is. And I thought to myself when I read that, well, that's a pretty sophisticated Darwinian perspective for the legal system to have, right? It's not self-evident. From a Darwinian, or fitness, or Hamiltonian fitness perspective, or something that seems, fairly obvious, but I'm not sure that's fairly obvious to everyone. And so that got me thinking, like, does the justice system in general operate like? I'm not saying that it's done consciously. I don't think any of this is done, informed by having read evolutionary biology. But just in terms of the kinds of payoffs that arise over the long term and the way legal system, particularly sort of, common law, the English sort of common law legal tradition, gradually adjusts because it has to, deal with circumstances in which, people do or don't, reject the law. And, how do you find the best outcomes that are going to, allow for social order? And this kind of thing, over time, is it possible that the solutions that the criminal justice system hits upon are in fact these kind of biologically oriented ones that have eugenic implications? Now, to come to the eugenic parts, I know I've been going on for a minute. Just let me go a couple more minutes to set it up, and then I'll let you go, Charles. So in the justice system, the sort of the models that are usually presented or defended are either it should be a form of punishment, so people do something wrong, so you punish them in some way, or it should be a form of rehabilitation, making people, changing people from being bad people to being good people. Or there's a theory of justice around a restoration, that you have to make, have to restore a person in some way. And certainly in the civil law, civil court, often that's the way it is. You do damages, in tort law, you do damages and you have to make restoration. And that has a eugenic element to it too, obviously, right? Because resources are the ways in which, we either attract mates, the more resources we have, the better quality mates you probably can attract. And if you have children, you have the resources to invest in the children, to give them the best opportunities in life, and therefore give your genes the best opportunities. So from a selfish gene perspective, right? If you're damaging someone's resources, tort law requires you to make restitution, so they have those resources back, and it costs you. The person who actually has done the damage suffers then, right? So it's kind of like, a sort of Darwinian system in the sense that, that you can't interfere with someone else's selfish genes, and if you do, we're going to interfere with your selfish genes, right? So not only, it's not like society is going to pay the people who were damaged by your action. You're going to pay it. It's going to come out of your pocket, right? So we're creating a disincentive for people's selfish genes who are inclined to interfere too much with other people's selfish genes. But then if you think about criminal justice, I mean, it's kind of you can think of it the same way, right? I mean, if you're going around doing damage to other people, then, yes, we're going to put you in jail, certainly, so that can be thought of. Now, if you think jail is a place where you can be rehabilitated, you can think, oh, that's rehabilitation. We'll have, courses and you can take, or, whatever, right? But, or you can think of that as punitive. It's kind of like we're punishing you because we're locking you in this lousy place. But you can also think of it as eugenic, right? You can think of it as, we're putting you in a place where you're not going to be able to make more people who do the kind of things that you do, right? So we're going to lock you up with a bunch of people of the same sex, and you're just going to deal with that because we don't want you out there profiting in any way, genetically or materially or any other way. And I think, by the way, this is why conjugal visits at prison are quite controversial in a lot of people's minds, right? I don't think they think about it, but the implication is that, well, why, they think like, well, you're supposed to be being punished. So why should you be allowed to have your girlfriend or wife or whatever come and sleep over with you, right? Shouldn't be allowed to do that. But, when you think of it from a eugenics or, Darwinian point of view, then it's like, well, why should this guy have the chance to make children? Because the whole point of it, we're trying to deny him from the possibility to be able to take advantage from each other. So all of this to me has sort of a eugenics flavor to it. So what do you think about all that, Charles?
Okay, there was a lot there. By the way, how was my sound? I noticed I didn't have this. Like, I have two microphones in here. I noticed I didn't bring this one down. Like, is my sound okay?
Yeah, you sound fine to me.
Okay, great. There's also like a heater going on in here right now. I don't know if that's being picked up. Hopefully not.
I don't hear it.
Okay, that's fantastic. Okay, so there was a bunch of stuff you brought up. One of them was you were kind of talking about, like, do you see law as being kind of revenge or rehabilitation or restitution or whatever? And there was a point I made in a previous video, right? And I'll just kind of like bring it up again, just because this is a separate like discussion. What it seems like, okay, so I'll explain in terms of like kind of a straw man story. You have man A and man B. Okay, we'll move that over here. Man A and man B. So man A sleeps with man B's wife. Man B kills man A. Man A's family kills man B. Man B's family starts, attacking and killing, and they start killing each other. And then other families join in, and you get an escalating feud, right? And this can go on for generations. And this seems to happen in a lot of different cultures across the world at different times. And it seems like in different places at different instances of time, and like you can see this as being, the same culture just at different points in time. It seems like there's mechanisms within the culture, like cultural institutions, like patterns of behavior that tend to suppress, this escalating feud. And the ones I'm aware of, for example, are deference of vengeance to a third party. And like we have that where we live in Vancouver. We have, the courts and, the police, and they deal with vengeance for you effectively, even though they might not call it vengeance. In some societies, they have what's called honor killings, right? So you might have a situation where man A sleeps with man B's wife. In that case, man A's family, because he slept with man B's wife, would kill man A to stop the escalation of violence, right? I think honor killings are more known for killing women in that case, but like that would be an instance of an honor killing. There's also ritualized mediation. There's word guilds. There's ritualized escalation, restitution, like et cetera, right? So there's that phenomenon. So that kind of like, gets into the kind of like revenge and vengeance type point of view on this stuff. There's also, rehabilitation, and that's a type of view, or and there are some people that go as far as to like almost treat this as a disease, right? It's something that can be cured. Like there's something wrong with the person, maybe, mentally or socially or culturally. And if we can fix that, this problem wouldn't happen in the first place, right? It's not really, their fault in a sense. So there's that point of view. And the restitution, I think that also gets into, deferring vengeance to a third party. It's another way of kind of dealing with it, right? Okay, so that's addresses like a bit of what you talked about. You also talked about a kind of evolution happening with law. I think we've kind of touched this. I don't remember if it was on video or not, but I think it'd be, not here, not right now. It'd be useful for us to at one point talk about what's being called cultural evolution, or you can think of it, it's within the realm of social learning. So that's an interesting kind of phenomenon, like how those things kind of can happen, right? Not all things that exist it seems, within like cultural evolution, not all the results of that are necessarily helpful, right? Like it seems like some of the results of cultural evolution can be okay. So you can have problems that exist, right? Like maybe there's a type of food that has a poison in it, and you can have like a practice. It might be a superstition or whatever that allows you to remove that toxin from the food and have you eat it, right? And you might not be aware that toxin exists or that ritual removes it, right? But it still seems to happen. But also you can get these other kind of cultural institutions that can evolve that can actually be harmful to people, and they can be passed on for quite a bit. The other thing you said, okay, so the law advantaging kind of like people. Okay, so a couple things with that. I remember someone saying something like, a lot of kind of cultures like ours, they tend to help the people in long life history mode and harm people in short life history mode, right? And I think that's an interesting kind of idea. And it also seems like, what we would call law, and maybe in other cultures, what you might call other things that maybe are similar to law, like where there's like coercive force put behind stuff. They don't always seem to be like, it doesn't always seem to create a win-win positive sum situation. I remember one tribe, and like our mutual friend Jerem would remember who these are, but there was some ritual where older men would get, so they train, I think, the younger boys to play a certain kind of flute, and it would prepare them to give, what's a technical term I can get for this? A type of, sorry?
Fellatio?
Yeah. So let's use that word. So they would, I think, force the young boys to give that to them, right? And I mean, this is a cultural kind of institution that would advantage older over younger, and also older with a certain kind of sexual preference. So it's not that these type of stuff that arises out of law like are win-win positive sum situations. You can have zero-sum situations where some are advantaged and some are not, right? And I think we even see a lot of these like within our own society. Like certainly, for example, like there's the aspect of deferring violence to a third party, like we have with the court systems, where you can interpret this as preventing this escalating feudal type violence, right? But I mean, it does happen where like people within that system, like whether it be judges or police, take advantage of that power, right? Because they have special powers that other people don't, and ways that they're treated that other people don't, and they abuse that, right? And some of this is uninstitutionalized, and that other people who are like judges and police would say no, that's wrong, and try to punish them. But there's also over in different societies at different points in times, even some in our society, where it's institutionalized that those people have this special rights, and the others who have those special rights will defend it, right? And you have a zero-time type situation for that. So my point is that it's not everything that results from this is advantageous to everyone, right? Sometimes it's not always positive sum win-win. Sometimes it's zero sum, right?
Yeah, I mean, like if the position I was trying to stake out there around making a case that the justice system is eugenic, I think is premised on the idea that it's a zero sum situation. Right? Yeah. I mean, there's no assumption there that ever. I mean, the assumption is that the eugenic assumption is that certain people left in society are going to do damage to other people's selfish genes and the aspirations thereby, and therefore those people, two things. First of all, from the sort of punishment or social order perspective, you want to have them in a place where they can't do that damage. But then, like I said, I think there's this second level, this eugenic level, that not only that, not only do we want to keep them away from other people, but we want to keep them in a place where they are not going to profit. Now, they might profit within jail, right? There's economy, in jail, and struggle over resources and stuff, but it's not affecting the larger society. And aside of conjugal visits, which is the one tricky part of my whole hypothesis here, aside of that, they can't reproduce. Right. And that's sort of like, to me, the key idea. If you're going to think of the criminal justice system as operating eugenically, and take note, then, I argue it's arguably a good thing, and it's distinctly coercive. Right. So here we're, if this is true, we're saying that there's a form of coercive eugenics that actually society approves of, though, as you might note, they wouldn't want to call it eugenics, but I'm saying effectively that's what it is. And it is a zero-sum game, and it is eugenics, and these are the consequences. So I don't know, but
yes. So okay. So there's one aspect in that, how are these people like reproducing, right? Like, it'd be nice if we had some data to like see this one way or the other, but we'll just like, think about this for a bit. What happens if the kind of behavior an individual does that leads them to, get put in prison, right? What happens if before they go into prison, it makes it more likely that they'll have a bunch of children, right? Let's say like each of these people might father like say 5 children, and then they go to jail, right? Now you might say, okay, well, going to jail like is eugenic towards others. Like obviously the people going to jail don't see as eugenic; they probably see it as being dysgenic, right? Because it's against their genetic interests, right? So whether it's eugenic or dysgenic is subjective, but what happens if those people end up having more children before that happens? Like that same behavior that gets them in jail also causes them to have more children. Another aspect is, are these life sentences, right? Like if they're not life sentences and they're out later on, then they have other opportunities to have children, right? Now it can be that some of these individuals, they've been in jail for so long, and they don't have, really any way to do the things that would attract a mate, for example. Like maybe, if you've been in there for 20 years, you don't know how to have a job. It might mean that, you go back to like theft or armed robbery or something like that, and it ends up you wind up back in jail, right? You might not have the opportunity to reproduce again, but I suspect that's not the case for all individuals. I've talked to some people that work as police, and what I understand for some of these individuals, like some of them who, like for us, we might call it like gang type activity, right? My understanding is some of these individuals actually like being in jail for a while. It makes it so that it's very competitive when they're outside of jail and doing whatever they're doing. Like there seems to be an interesting ecosystem. So you might have the drug dealers, and then there's kind of what I think most people would kind of call gangsters. They're kind of above them, and they seem to control different territories, right? So they claim a piece of land, and anyone doing business within that land, they take a cut from. So taxes, essentially, right? It's a very interesting kind of phenomenon. You have like different type of individuals in gangs, or like that, have a gang that are fighting for territory and like tax. I think it's the drug dealers they take money from, also sometimes also the prostitutes, I think. I'm not sure about local businesses. Like there's a cliche around like, going to local businesses for protection money and stuff like that. But there's like an interesting taxation type system that happens with this and battles between them. But going in jail gives you a kind of rest. It seems, my understanding is like some perceive it as almost like a vacation, right? Later on they're, back outside of jail and whatnot. But yeah, that's kind of an interesting perspective.
Okay, so a number of points. You made a number of interesting statements there. So I don't know. I went sort of crazy. I didn't have any papers. I had to go find some paper to write this down. So I don't know if I got all the points here. So I mean, first of all, you make the point. You made this point earlier in the discussion, and yes, we're for obviously eugenics and dyseugenics is in the eye of the beholder, obviously, right? So when I'm putting forward this hypothesis, I guess I'm assuming some sort of perspective of the state or society, if that's such a thing, something like that, right? That's what I mean by eugenics. Perfectly willing to concede that other people might disagree about what is better and what's not better, sort of thing, right? So, but more substantially, right? So one thing you commented on is like, how many children do these people have? Like I think earlier you also were talking about the suggestion that maybe our society is more beneficial to people with slower life histories and fast life histories. And one of the things behind that may well be that people who are criminally inclined, may often have faster life histories, low impulse control, which how they end up in jail in the first place. So you're right, they may actually be having more children. So the question here, so there's two different questions. Like, first of all, does the criminal system work as a form of eugenics? And you're right, if these people are having lots of children before they ever get into jail, or a disproportionate number of children before they get into jail, then the criminal justice system may not be an effective form of eugenics. But of course, that's separate from the question of whether it's intended or, unconsciously, consciously or unconsciously, I would say probably unconsciously, intended to be a form of eugenics. Those are separate questions, right? But it would be interesting to know the actual numbers on that. But the other thing is that you were saying, well, you made the point about, well, these probably, these usually aren't life sentences, and, usually they're not life sentences. Most people don't go to jail for life. But the interesting thing, of course, is that, and we should emphasize that we're almost completely talking about men, right? Like, I don't remember the number. I think like 90% of all people in jail are men or something like this, right? And I think for violent crime, the number's probably even higher than that. But anyways, so bear in mind, though, you're right, these people aren't going to jail for life, but most of the people who are engaging in crime, especially in violent crime, these kind of things, the kind of things that you particularly want to eugenically, take out of the gene pool, right? Assuming this is eugenic, right? Most of them are young, right? They're in prime reproductive age, and in fact, often the mating incentive and the violent incentive and the criminal incentive are all bound together. You were talking about gangs, and this is a big part of what drives gangs. I mean, there's been research showing that gang members have more access to women than non-gang members do in various populations, right? So these things are all tied together. So yes, these people are not getting life sentences, but they're committing their crimes in prime reproductive age, and they're going to jail in prime reproductive age. So from a eugenic point of view, you're sort of you don't need to put them in jail for their whole life. What you want to do is put them in jail for the period of time that they're more likely to be engaging in reproductive activity. Right. And so, particularly keenly motivated to do so. Right. As people get older, they lose a bit of they lose some of the testosterone and some of the motivation and all this. Right. But young people, young men, this is a key time around reproduction, and, a key time to have access to young women and this sort of thing. So from a eugenics perspective, again, this way of approaching criminal justice, crime and law, it's like, kind of does seem eugenic.
Yeah, there was one point I wanted to go back to. You were kind of like reacting to something I said. I said that I remember reading a comment from someone that was suggesting that our type of culture kind of punishes people with a low life or slow or a short life history, and helps out people with a long life history. And then it sounded like you kind of implied that all or maybe most people that are in crime, or what would be considered illegal, like some of the stuff that's considered a crime, there are parallels that are considered illegal, which is kind of interesting. But all of them have a short life history, or short life history. I don't know how much this is, but I'd like to. I'm just going to tell a story. I don't know how representative this is, but I think people respond better to stories. So let me just tell this story, and I'm going to try to remove a bit of names.
I think you should remove all the names.
yeah, I'll remove the names. I'll try to remove context, but enough to kind of give it this. So, like my background, I ended up going to university. I really didn't have a choice. I think I probably would have chosen anyways, but my mom was like, "You have no choice." And doing that, I originally started as a mathematician, and I did that for quite a while. And there was I think I was like doing 4th year math, and I was in this career fair, and I asked these people in career fair, what kind of jobs can I get as a mathematician? And what I was told at the time is, unless you're willing to move away from Vancouver and move to the US, the only jobs you can get really here are working for insurance companies doing what's called actuarial math, and you end up predicting when people die. And I thought that was gruesome. And at the time, like, I was taking computer science for fun, and I kind of like switched over to that. And I ended up doing that. And I ended up doing like a bunch of physics and chemistry too, because I thought that kind of thing was fun. But it ended up that I had this kind of education, and around when I graduated, the internet and tech and computers just started kind of taking off. And I have a kind of personality, I guess, maybe. And also, like, there was family members that kind of took this path where I was entrepreneurial, and I started creating companies, but also using those skills, right? And it took a certain path. But what I wonder is, if I didn't kind of have that kind of background, could I have taken a very different path? And I remember there were some 2 individuals that were a lot younger than me, and both of them, they seemed quite bright. They were doing well at like subjects like math, like subjects that I did well at, right? And they ended up going the route of like, doing drug dealing and stuff like that. At one point, I remember hearing about it. I hadn't like been in contact with them while this was kind of going on, but I heard stories like, they would have open up drawers and they were making like hundreds of thousands of dollars per month, right? So they had a lot of money. But I do know that they got like murdered at a certain point, right? And I think it's like, we even like lived near each other. That's how I knew them. Like, I knew them as little kids, right? And they seemed like quite bright. And you can think of like, for example, like think of like the drug deal and think it's a type of business. It's illegal, right? And it's very dangerous, right? But it is a kind of like business mentality. And I took a route where I used my math and computer science and software engineering skills, and I created tech companies, and I did that a whole bunch of times. I took a very different path. I'm not risk adverse. I take a lot of risks, each time I do that. But I can see like someone who goes into that, it's not simply just, short life history. Some of it's long life history. It's planning, like, and it might be you're doing something very, very risky. And there's even like legal things that are considered part of this. Like, and some people consider this very negative, but people who kind of like, as an adjacent business to like some of the business of wars that people in certain governments do, there's kind of like plundering that happens in these different countries and stuff like that. But this is considered legal, but it's similar in a way to those kind of businesses, right? I don't know how many individuals are like that go into like the kind of like gangs and drug dealing type business and weapons smuggling and all that other stuff. But I suspect some of these individuals you might consider like long life history, like quite smart, quite methodical. They're doing something very high risk, but they're running a business, right? Which is kind of interesting. And there's ways where, their money isn't legal, and you get into the whole money laundering thing and all that stuff. And like for myself, like I guess I'm giving a bit more information about myself. Like, I was in the finance and banking industry, and like even the credit bureau industry for quite a while. So I'm quite aware of, like, I've created technology to stop that kind of stuff and detect it, right? But yeah, it's kind of an interesting like parallel. I think like with some of the stuff with crime, like it's a bit more complex in that I don't think it's simply a story of individuals who have a short life history. I suspect there's a number of individuals with a long life history. So yeah, that's just comments I wanted to give.
Yeah. So, I mean, like, okay, so a couple things. I mean, obviously, I mean, I can't, I can't believe I'm saying this to you, but obviously I was generalizing.
Yeah.
I mean, like all the, and to anyone watching or listening, right? These things, these conversations, always, follow the, have the following, on average, so if we don't say on average, we mean on average, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's always assume on average, right? So that may be true, and I don't doubt that, that these kind of people exist. I didn't mean obviously to exist to suggest that every single person involved in crime was the same. But I was also making some distinction, and this is maybe a point to sort of branch out and say that, if there really is a eugenics agenda to the criminal justice system, however unconsciously it may be at work, that then you start getting to some really complicated questions, right? Because I think if most people, if you could explain to most people that what I'm saying, and they would accept it would be true, most people would probably be okay with that, as it related to, say, violent criminals, right? But when you're putting people in jail for decades, sometimes for victimless crimes, or victim, obviously even the term victimless crime is a loaded term for some people. But I mean, if people just want to buy drugs to use themselves, I mean, who's being hurt by this? And if you're selling it to them, if you're filling the market niche, then what's really wrong with this? And and should a program that's really meant to weed bad genes out of the system, if that in fact is part of what it's doing, do you really want to weed out of the gene pool people whose only crime is to provide goods for other people that are victimless, right? So I mean, I'm not sure that your example of people with long life history or dispositions even would fall under the imperative to weed them out of the gene pool, assuming that the criminal justice system had this sort of eugenic dimension to it. Maybe if people were more honest about the eugenic aspect of the criminal justice system, maybe they'd start thinking a little differently about some of the people who are actually thrown in jail. Because I mean, obviously, there's a big difference between people who are, selling drugs to people who want them and people who are murdering people. Now, I know in some contexts, those two things get intertwined together for sure, right? I mean, your friends may not have been, violent, but there's obviously a lot of violence in organized crime. But
they got into violence, like as far as I know.
Yeah. Okay. So these two things certainly do get tied up together. But of course, it's arguable. I know the argument against, but it's arguable that the reason why the violence gets involved in these things is because they're made illegal. Right. So if you just let people alone, you just sort of said, violent crime, you can't do that, and anything else you can do if your own body, whatever you want, sort of thing, sort of do that, then, these things, would presumably become separated from each other. And who knows, maybe acknowledging the eugenic element of the criminal justice system might contribute to clearer thinking on this. I don't know. I just wanted to throw one more thing in about the idea of the criminal justice system as eugenic, and I don't know how extensive this is, right? But we always hear these stories about women who fall in love with criminals on the basis of their reputation, and this is particularly famous for serial killers who receive all these love letters from these strange women, right? And now, of course, they don't actually get to consummate it, so the eugenic element is still working. But there's an interesting dynamic at work there. I'm not quite sure what's going on.
Yeah, there's I wish I had these prepared. I remember reading something, like I've read a lot of stuff over the years. Remember reading something where I think they were showing photos of different individuals, and a number of these individuals were, criminals that were convicted, and some of them were just like randoms, and they were trying to see like which ones that women found more attractive. And I think there was a bias in favor of the criminals, which is kind of interesting.
And they were just looking at pictures. Is that what you said?
Yeah, and I think I've also seen some stuff like I might be misremembering. Like this is something like I remember reading a long time ago. I do think there's a performance type aspect to it too. Like the behaviors also seem to attract like the very kind of dominant like type behavior. Whether normal people would call it dominance or whatever. It seems like a lot of women are like quite attracted to that.
Yeah, that and that, and I've heard that too, right? And I've read stuff in relationship to that too. And to the degree that that's true, that seems to make the case even stronger for the criminal justice system as eugenic, right? I mean, if these are people engaging, assuming a genetic cause of some kind, right? If these are people engaging in behavior you don't want into society, and they're above average attractive, sex, I mean, that's even more reason to lock them away and hide them away from the opposite sex, right?
Yeah. You know, I had one woman who will be watching this, by the way. She told me, she said something to me once. I'm not saying this is representative. I don't know, but I'm just going to say, because I think it's kind of interesting. She said that all women want dominant males, but not all of them can get them. So to the degree that's true, I mean, that might be relevant. Just a question. Has your, for your children, you know, your mother, your children, like, did she ever say anything in terms of like dominance towards you that she was attracted to?
Charles, I'm not talking about my personal life, hon. Are you out of your mind? No, my children and, you know, my personal life are off topic or off whatever, I can't think of what the expression is. Off limits. Right. They're off limits. What a crazy question. Right. I actually should edit that out, but I'm not going to. I'm going to leave it in. Just so there's no doubt going forward. Anyways, allow me to, you know, and I've been having a little fun with this. So allow me to say to anyone listening or watching, you know, I'm not advocating this. I'm not saying that, you know, that the criminal justice system should be a eugenic system. I'm just saying maybe it is, right? Yeah. Oh shit! Hit my microphone again. You know, it's you know, maybe at least, I'm not saying the whole thing, but at least part of it may be motivated, at least unconsciously, by these sort of eugenic impulses. And I think if you drew it to most people's attention, most people would say, yeah, okay.
Maybe one way to kind of like think of this is that because, like, I mean, when you use the word eugenics or dysgenic, there's kind of a preference to it, right? Like, what do you exalt? What do you think is valuable? And like some of what you think is valuable might end up helping your genes, right? You could say that, okay, does the criminal justice system select for something, right? Or select against something? You can think of it that way. And okay, so that's one thing. And then the question might be, is it to some individuals' advantage that this selection is happening, right? And if that's the case, you could say, okay, well, that's a type of eugenics, right? Or dysgenics, depending on your perspective, right? So it's just like, is there selection, and are some individuals advantaged by this selection?
That's exactly what I've been saying.
Yeah.
Wasn't I clear? That's exactly what I'm saying. Yeah, I mean, and I would say it's eugenic in the sense, I mean, most people would say that they don't want a lot of, you know, violent people or people who are prone to do harm to others or to steal other people's property wandering around. And if there's any chance that that's a genetic thing, genetic dispositions give rise to that, then yeah, we, you know, maybe a little eugenics at the level, a little coercive, involuntary eugenics at the level of the criminal justice system isn't such a bad thing. All I'm saying is that, you know, all I'm saying here is that, you know, is that we think we have a simple understanding of the eugenics debate, positive and negative, coercive and voluntary, but maybe it's a little more complicated, and maybe we all sort of happily go along with some coercive eugenics, even though we don't want to particularly call it that.
Yeah, I mean, I think like people go along with coercion, like just in general. Like, for example, like people consider murder wrong, but they seem to make an exception for war, right?
Yeah. But here's the key point, though, right? They don't call it murder, right?
No,
the same thing is that they're not going to call what's going on in our criminal justice system eugenics the same way they're not going to call killing other people on a warfield murder, right?
Yeah, or like they think kidnapping's wrong, but an arrest is fine. That's not kidnapping, right? There's like exceptions, right? They even consider it a good thing, right?
Right.
And I'm personally not saying it's good or bad. I'm just saying like if you remove all this kind of like other attributes and you just look at the actions, there's individuals, this is what happens, right? Like it's the same type of thing, right? It's just like one is considered acceptable, one's considered not acceptable. And like, maybe that's the way the criminal justice system sees, like, we don't call it eugenics, even though like, if you remove like all these kind of like extra information, like it functions the same way.
Yeah. Yeah. All right, then. I think we've got that covered.
Cool.
Think so?
Yeah.
Good.
Sounds like it.
All right, then. So you're going to be away next week. Is that right? I think you are, right?
Correct. So I'm flying out soon, and I'll be on another part of the planet.
Another part of the
that's
planet.
Quite warm.
You won't even say where you're going, and you want me to talk about my personal life of my ex and my children. You're crazy, man.
Yeah. I think over time, probably more and more will kind of get out about personal lives and other stuff, and we'll see how it goes.
Okay, well, we're not going to rush it here. All right. So, but Patricia will be back, folks. And I know there's at least one person out there who watches regularly who thinks that we should only ever have Patricia on screen. So he's probably been very disappointed the last couple of weeks, but he'll be happy to see that she's back next week.
Yeah.
So I think that's it for now, Charles. Have a great trip. We'll see you in a couple of weeks. And that's it. Bye.
Okay, see you, Michael.